When I was a kid, I absolutely loved comic books. Comics were not only simple and easy to understand, but also a really entertaining art form, especially when telling a story. And I remember all the times on Sundays or the days where the newspaper would come, and I'd read through all the comics available. Out of all these comics, there's actually one that really stands out to me, and one that I didn't really read too often in the newspapers. And one of my all-time favorite comics happened to be Calvin and Hobbes. And even to this day, I look back fondly at the work of Bill Watterson. And to be honest, I think that I have every single book of his. Comics are just such an interesting art form as well as writing piece combined together to tell a story. But what's even more is I really enjoyed Watterson's personal life, and especially his work with watercolor and poetry. And speaking of poetry, he has some very memorable ones at that. A Nauseous Nocturne is a great example of story combined with imagery to depict a poem. And Watterson has many memorable pieces. For this video, however, I wanted to talk about a poem of his that not too many people talk about, and one that not too many people know about either. This poem doesn't even have a title. And this poem is tucked away in between the first few pages of the indispensable Calvin and Hobbes. There's a simple painting by Watterson himself of a nice desert mesa view, and I assume he just did this in his free time. But anyways, the poem goes as follows. I made a big decision a little while ago. I don't remember what it was, which probably goes to show that many times a simple choice can prove to be essential, even though it often might appear inconsequential. I must have been distracted when I left my home, because left or right I'm sure I went. I wonder which it was. Anyways, I never veered. I walked in that direction, utterly absorbed, it seems, in quiet introspection. For no reason I can think of, I've wandered far astray, and that is how I got to where I find myself today. As a kid, to be honest, I never really even looked at these poems. I was more interested in the adventures of Calvin and Hobbes, not in the author himself, or the interest of poetry at all. I think poetry is one thing that's hard for kids to get into these days, especially when you use big words. But what I really love and enjoy now is coming back to these poems and seeing a mixture of the childish humor mixed with the emotions of an adult. I really love how this poem follows the iambic pentameter and how each line rhymes in couplets with an AABB format. It's something that I've always appreciated in poems and always reminds me of that Dr. Seuss kind of style of poem. And although this style of poem is less seen nowadays and we have more free-form and free verse poetry, I've always loved and appreciated poetry that rhymes in general. It just shows that the people who are writing them really are dedicated to this and are a master at their work. And like I mentioned, it's childish in nature, but also has a deep meaning behind it. The biggest part of the poem is this idea in the beginning. I made a big decision a little while ago. And many times in life we do make big decisions. Sometimes they have huge impacts on our lives that we remember for the rest of our lives. But many times there are also choices that we make, simple choices that almost escape our memory after we make them. And as he was making this big decision, he doesn't remember what it was. So at the time it must have felt, like he mentions a little later, it might appear inconsequential or even something that doesn't really matter. Then the poem is broken down into a more life journey style aspect with the middle lines, talking about how he must have been distracted as he left his home, and that he's going a certain direction but doesn't really veer or meander off through it. Even though in a way it's almost ironic that at this point where he's talking about not meandering off the path, the poem is also meandering from the main point of his argument. And as he mentions, I never veered, I walked in that direction, utterly absorbed it seems in quiet introspection. There is quite a lot of thought that Watterson is putting into these lines, and I've seen from a few of his other works or writings that he really loves the word introspection. It's just one of those words that means that you're deeply thinking about something. But throughout this whole poem, I think the last two lines are the most powerful and the most impactful for me. For no reason I can think of, I've wandered far astray, And that is how I got to where I find myself today. Many times in our lives, we have choices to make, and like this poem mentions, some of those choices are simple choices that don't appear inconsequential at first glance. But many times, the simplest of choices also have the greatest impacts on our lives. We seem to wander so far astray from what we were originally intending to do that people find new career paths or make huge life choices. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be a bad thing that we're wandering far astray. Life is all about second chances and becoming better people to the people around us as well as to strangers. I've seen a few comments about this poem, how as you grow up, you begin to understand this poem more and more. And I can definitely say that's the case for me as well. As a kid, I just brushed through it, not really caring about what the meaning of it was, maybe just reading it for fun, just to see what the author had to say. But now I realize that, as he mentions, the choices that you make really do matter. And that's how you find yourself today. It's just really great to see a poem that rhymes, and it just makes poetry fun. I think part of the aspect that draws me so much to poetry is those rhyming poems. In a way, it's a almost lost art to create a good poem anymore that rhymes. Sure, we have songs and other stuff that rhyme, but they don't have the impact that poetry does. I think nowadays we are more lenient with poetry to create free verse and even paragraphs of lines that we consider poems. But even back in Watterson's day, it felt almost sacred in a way to create a poem and to create rhymes, something that has a great impact. And to be honest, just like Watterson's words, I think we've all wandered far astray. And many times a simple choice can have great and lasting impact. And that's where we find ourselves today.